Hello, my name is Jasmine Webb. I am presenting a lecture titled Religion's Role in Knighthood. Were Knights Really Warrior Monks? This lecture is made in mind for a PhD level course focusing on knighthood and chivalry in medieval Europe. So, to get into basically the meat and bones of what it is to be a knight, it's a very religiously specific kind of lifestyle. The very foundation of knighthood, of course, we start out with the code of chivalry. It varies very much. It goes from, across time and space. So if you've got a knight in, the early thousands versus 1400s, like there's a difference. You're going to see that. You're going to see differences in the code of chivalry between a British and a French knight. But either way, they're very similar because they all are linked to the Christian religion as a whole. Chivalry, at its basic and most raw definition, we get that from the Normans. They're the ones that kind of come up with this. Early, I think it's about 1040s, we start seeing the introduction of the Code of Chivalry from the Normans, and it was originally developed to help with managing the art of war on horseback. So we see in modern depiction, or in past depictions, of knights, usually they've got someone fighting on the ground with the knights on their horse. That's where we see the Normans kind of introducing this, because what was happening is they, were so skilled at horseback fighting, they realized it was very bad for their enemies, and they didn't really stand much of a chance. Obviously, the whole point of battle is to win, but it was seen as tasteless, sort of, to be winning your fights by basically trampling a bunch of people with your horse. So they developed the Code of Chivalry. This starts catching on over the years, and eventually you start seeing French, British, some Spanish. All these knights are starting to begin to adhere to the same code that the Normans originally created, maybe tweaking it a little bit, but for the most part, it's the same thing. It has a few basic rules, usually in terms of, treatment of women, treatment of nobility, all that kind of stuff. But at almost every single iteration of the Code of Chivalry, no matter what time period or place it's coming from, you're going to see that it demands, first and foremost, respect to the church and to God. That's where we start really seeing a lot of the religious side of knighthood really taking an effect. To get more even into this kind of stuff, so knighthood, just their general practices, that's the methodology of being a knight. The Code of Chivalry is the basis of behavior. However, if you look at the foundation of any kind of knighthood, you're going to find religion, specifically Christian, being at the core. It goes all the way back to, let's just look at the way that they are knighted. So part of the reading for this course, is Geoffrey de Charny, his A Knight's Own Guide to Chivalry. He is a 14th century knight in France under King Louis IV. Excellent example. He writes about a lot of different expectations that knights kind of dealt with. He writes about what was considered most appropriate versus least appropriate for a knight to kind of do. And he starts with he gives us later into the book a very, very good understanding of how specifically one was made a knight, at least in France. Obviously, this again differs a little bit across time and space, but for the example that I'm about to give, let's look at this. Religion takes front seat in everything for these guys. This is the way that they, handle law. They were generally assisting, kind of acting as almost proxy local law force. Because remember, this is feudalist societies, so they're under their, whichever lord is kind of paying them at the moment. That's who they're with. But everything goes back to the church. When you're trying to become a knight, most of them have been living in this lifestyle for a good while. They know exactly what is expected of them. Most of them have been pages or squires in some form or another, but it's not always. And so to do this first part of being a knight is you go through this day-long kind of reflection period, so to speak. Usually you kind of go off. You're not really encouraged to talk to anybody, or if you do, it's very quickly, and it's a solemn time for these individuals. Once they have managed to do that, and they've had their moments, their quiet time. They've said their prayers to the Lord. They've, reflected on their behavior through life so far. Usually they're about like mid-20s, maybe their early 30s. They then go to their local church. They repent, they ask for forgiveness, and, they go through that whole process. It's Catholic in nature, so there's that. Then, once they have, gone through that process, they go through a almost ritualistic kind of style of bathing. They bathe themselves, and a group of knights who are already knighted, usually also in their own specific colors, usually their lord's colors, but everything has a reason behind it. They all come to the knight who's just recently bathed, and they dress him. They dress him in white to symbolize his new beginning, his purity in the eyes of the Lord, because he's just repented and, done all that. Then, once he has been bathed, he's been clothed, everything's going, he gets brand new tools. So he's got a new sword usually. He's going to get new belts. He's going to get new shoes, everything. Everything's brand new to signify that this is a brand new start for him. He is essentially becoming a warrior monk, for lack of better words. Once that's happened, he goes to his local lord. They do the shoulder taps, and he's brought into the fold. But all this to say is that entire process of even just becoming a knight is highly religious in nature. So it's hard to, see them after this in any kind of way non-religiously minded. They went, most of them tended to follow after their lords, but in the example of the Crusades, we see them very quickly, shift. Some of their lords did not approve of that, but they go because the church demanded it, and the church is what came first for them. There are some arguments that could be made about, were knights actually warrior monks, or were they essentially hired hands? There's some arguments that could be made, not usually too strongly, but like some people could bring up. So in our reading with Miller, that talks about cutting off horses' tails as a way of proving masculinity and basically humiliating someone that you're, unhappy with. It was very frequently used against church officials, which is kind of an interesting, fight, considering we've got such a religiously minded group. But when those knights felt wronged by the church, and not the church specifically, but like local deacons usually, what they would do is they would go find the deacon's horse and then cut its tail off. And usually that was a very public occurrence. That was a very humiliating thing. It was basically seen as kind of feminizing that, deacon, that man. And it was just kind of, most people today don't really think of that when they think, of Christian-like behavior. And of course, it kind of doesn't really follow the Christ way of life that we have seen. But that's one method. That's one argument that could be made. Deborn. So some poems of his experiences going into battle are very explicit, I suppose I could say. It's not inappropriate, but he's very specific in mentioning how much he loves battle. He was a French knight, just like Charney, but he very much enjoys going into battle. He enjoys the rush. It's essentially like he's kind of an adrenaline junkie, almost, from reading his work and seeing what he has to say. So that is where some of those arguments could be made, of like, were they really so, the proper Christian, or were they just hired hands that enjoyed going to battle and getting paid for it? I personally would argue that still, no, it is a very religiously backed kind of instance, but those are some things that could be brought to light and might want to be noted when you're looking at the complexity of knighthood, because that is a big thing. These knights this is a lifestyle. They don't just stop being knights when they hit a certain age. Most of them go on to train younger individuals if they've survived that long. I mean, obviously it's a dangerous lifestyle. You're fighting for a living, but for the most part, we see all of this kind of coming together, and it's expected that many people would go to the knights for legal, advice. They would go to them for, how do I handle speaking to a woman properly, all kinds of things. And they were also known as kind of the safekeepers of a lot of stuff. So if a local peasant needed assistance with anything really, they could call on the knights, and the knights might be able to assist if they weren't otherwise occupied with something to do with their lord or a war. So all of this to say is that knighthood at its core is a highly Christian and religious experience. It is specific. We have not seen anything since like it. And so it's just fascinating to really get into all of this and understand just what it took to be a knight. Because we see a lot of this nowadays, when we look at movies and, television shows, even some books, when they are depicting knights, it's usually a very rough kind of individual. It's usually someone who's, or, humorously clunky in his armor that's too heavy for him or whatever it is. And we are not seeing the reality of knights who are fantastically athletic individuals who very, very strictly adhered to this Christian lifestyle. Because if you didn't adhere to it, you could very easily be stripped of your title, and that was a lifetime of shame that you did not want to be dealing with. And so, even in the examples of De Born, like, you didn't see him ever mentioning any kind of sacrilegious things. He talked about very much enjoying all kinds of stuff, but for the most part, he never specifically goes against the Bible or Christian, the church in any kind of way. So, really interesting information, but I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for your time. Goodbye.